In Syria's southern region of Daraa, a public movement started by a group of students on March 15, 2011, led to the opposition seizing control of Damascus amid jubilant crowds exactly 13 years later. This event marked the end of the Ba'ath regime's 61-year reign, a bloody era. Following clashes between anti-regime armed groups, led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, and regime forces in the western countryside of Aleppo, on the morning of November 27th, events unfolded at a dizzying pace. On the night of December 7th, opposition forces entered the capital, Damascus. It was announced that Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad had fled to Russia, where he and his family were granted asylum. How did Damascus fall so quickly? What transpired in Syria during the 13-year civil war? In this video, we aim to document history, providing a concise summary of the entire process in 10 key points to understand how we got here, the reasons behind the regime's rapid collapse, and potential scenarios for the future. First, let's rewind to the beginning and briefly recall what has happened in Syria since the revolution began in 2011, before returning to the present. In March 2011, influenced by the winds of the Arab Spring sweeping across the region, the Syrian people, who had lived under the Ba'ath regime for decades, began peaceful protests for freedom and justice. The revolution's symbolic figure was 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib. Al-Khatib was imprisoned in Daraa for writing the anti-Assad slogan, "You're next, doctor," on a wall. He was tortured to death, along with many other young people like him. The regime's violent response to these initially peaceful protests caused the situation to escalate rapidly. Anti-government protests flared up in various cities across Syria. The United Nations recorded that over 2,200 people were killed by Syrian security forces within the first 5 months of the conflict. During this period, the Syrian National Council, representing the political wing of the Syrian opposition, was officially established in Istanbul in August. In November, Syria was suspended from the Arab League for rejecting a proposed peace plan. Meanwhile, a coalition of opposition groups under the banner of the Free Syrian Army began attacking regime forces in Damascus and Aleppo. By the spring of 2012, the unrest had evolved into a full-blown civil war. In November of the same year, Syrian opposition forces announced the formation of a new umbrella organization called the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, commonly known as the Syrian National Coalition. In March 2013, thousands of fighters from Iran-backed Hezbollah joined the war to support the Syrian government, and extremist groups began to emerge in the power vacuum created by the conflict. In August, then U.S. President Barack Obama announced a limited military operation against Syrian targets in response to allegations that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against opposition forces and civilians. This incident became known in history as Obama's repeatedly crossed red line. By November, the United Nations reported that over 100,000 people had been killed since the start of the conflict. In July 2014, Daesh, under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared a caliphate after making significant territorial gains in Iraq and Syria. In September of the same year, a coalition consisting of the United States and Arab nations intensified their airstrikes against Daesh, targeting their strongholds in both Syria and Iraq. The conflict took a dramatic turn in September 2015 when Russia joined the fray and launched its first airstrikes in Syria in support of the Assad regime, significantly escalating their involvement in the war-torn country. By December 2016, the Assad government claimed victory in Aleppo following the evacuation of the last remaining rebel forces from the city. In October 2017, the Syrian Democratic Forces, considered an evolved version of the PKK-YPG and previously supported by the United States under the guise of fighting Daesh, announced the liberation of Raqqa from the clutches of the terrorist organization. In September 2018, Russia and Turkey announced the establishment of a demilitarized safe zone in Idlib. In October 2019, then U.S. President Donald Trump declared that the U.S. would withdraw from northeastern Syria, plunging the region into new chaos. In March 2020, Turkey and Russia agreed to a ceasefire in Idlib, the last opposition stronghold in Syria, and decided to establish a security corridor with joint patrols. During this period, the COVID-19 pandemic seemed to relatively slow down the conflict. In May 2021, Assad was re-elected. In February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to a gradual reduction in Russian support for Syria. In February 2023, the earthquake disaster centered in Kahramanmaraş was also felt in Syria, causing the deaths of approximately 8,000 people. In many cities and towns, people tried to rescue their loved ones from the rubble with their bare hands, as aid was almost non-existent. While discussions continued about Israel's ongoing massacres in Gaza and the fragile ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel and Lebanon, events in Syria captured the world's attention, starting on November 27th, with surprising developments on the ground. On the Wednesday, when the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon took effect, Syrian opposition forces led by Hay'at Tahrir, al-Sham, launched an offensive from their bases in northwestern Idlib against regime forces. The offensive, named the Operation to Deter Aggression, was reportedly initiated in retaliation for recent regime attacks on towns like Ariha and Sarmada in Idlib, which caused civilian casualties, including children. The operation was also intended to deter future assaults. This was the first large-scale offensive against Assad's forces since the Idlib ceasefire brokered by Erdogan and Putin in 2020. Anti-regime armed groups seized heavy weapons and military vehicles belonging to Assad's forces in the territories they captured. Many regime soldiers were killed and dozens were taken prisoner. The Syrian regime responded by bombing areas that had fallen to the opposition, while Russian air forces conducted airstrikes. However, these countermeasures were insufficient to turn the tide in favor of the regime. Between November 27th and December 7th, opposition groups made significant gains, capturing many cities from the regime, including symbolically important locations like Aleppo, Daraa, Hama, and Homs. On December 8th, opposition protesters entered critical sites in Syria's capital, Damascus, causing the Assad regime to lose much of its control over the city. At the infamous Sednaya prison in Damascus, known for torture, detainees were freed by protesters who stormed the facility. On the morning of Sunday, December 8th, the Ba'ath Party's 61-year-long rule, which began in 1963, officially collapsed when Damascus fell out of regime control. The Ba'ath regime, whose bloody reign was marked by a civil war triggered by the violent suppression of pro-freedom movements in 2011, came to an end. In a video broadcast on Syrian state television, a group of opposition members announced the fall of Assad, declaring that all prisoners in detention facilities had been freed. With the collapse of the Ba'ath regime and the end of the Assad family's era, statues of Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, were torn down in various cities across the country. While the operation launched by armed opposition groups was not unexpected, its rapid progression surprised many. The swift advance of the opposition, or conversely, the dramatic collapse of the Assad regime, can be attributed to certain internal and external factors. These factors can be grouped under three main headings, which local and international experts monitoring Syria largely agree upon. Before examining external factors, let us focus on one of the most significant but relatively overlooked reasons: the internal collapse of the Assad regime. For years, there was a prevailing belief that the crisis in Syria had been frozen, the conflicts had ceased, and the Assad regime had emerged victorious. This perception led to a decline in international attention, the near cessation of Syria-focused diplomacy, and the gradual redirection of global resources and policies toward other pressing issues. This trend became even more pronounced after October 7. For U.S. policymakers, the idea that regional actors were taking over the Syrian dossier, at least ostensibly, was seen as a source of relief. Meanwhile, conditions inside Syria continued to deteriorate. Beginning in 2023, Arab states initiated steps to reestablish contact with Assad, moving toward normalization of relations. In May 2023, Assad attended the Arab League summit in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 12 years, and delivered a speech. However, the assumption that this move bolstered and solidified Assad's position has proven to be profoundly misguided and hollow. While Assad might have appeared to gain traction on the regional and global stage, the reality was starkly different at home. Not only did he fail to secure a definitive victory in the civil war, but his regime also grew increasingly fragile. Assad's grip on Syria relied heavily on an economy reportedly sustained by the illegal trade of the psychoactive drug Captagon, plunging the country into an unprecedented state of collapse. Since the so-called settlement in 2020, Syria had failed to achieve even a semblance of stability or relief after 13 years of war. Instead, the humanitarian crisis worsened. The United Nations' latest reports reveal that at least 90% of Syrians now live below the poverty line. Under Assad's rule, Syria has become a haven for organized crime, with billions of dollars reportedly earned annually from drug trafficking. None of this wealth has benefited the Syrian people. Regions under Assad's control recently faced severe shortages of oil and gas supplies, leading to widespread crises over basic necessities such as bread and fuel. Salaries have plummeted dramatically, leaving Assad to contend with an increasingly disillusioned populace and a military largely unwilling to fight for him. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan succinctly described the situation during a speech in Doha. "We witnessed the regime's collapse through a slow decay. This explains how Aleppo fell without a single shot being fired and how other cities followed suit." It is worth recalling that Assad's regime, militarily weak for a long time, has only been sustained through the military support of Russia and Iran. Today, however, even those allies are faltering. Russia's economy has been severely battered by the war in Ukraine, while Iran finds itself increasingly constrained, particularly after October 7th. Assad now stands alone, without even those countries that normalized relations with him willing to rescue him from economic and political insolvency. At this point, let's delve deeper into the external factors that can be summarized under two headings. The Ukraine war in the Middle East after October 7th. The impact of the process that began with Russia's invasion of Ukrainian territory in 2022 on Syria is not new. Following its military gains in Syria, Russia shifted its focus to Ukraine, believing it had secured the future of the Assad regime. As a result, some groups trained and organized on Syrian soil were sent to the Ukrainian front. Russia significantly reduced its military presence in Syria, including military advisors, task forces, and even thousands of Wagner Group mercenaries. Adding to this, the victory of Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election on November 5th and its potential repercussions for the Ukraine war may have made it imperative for Russia, already weakened in Syria, to cut its losses in the region without achieving any new gains on another front. Iran, too, has been strained in Syria, particularly after October 7th due to its daily clashes with Israel. The weakening of Hezbollah, which forms the backbone of Iran's Shia militia network, and its retreat to Lebanon left a void that militias recruited from Iraq could not adequately fill. Turkey's role and impact in the latest operation have been widely discussed. It seems reasonable to suggest that Ankara, fearing a new wave of refugees due to Assad forces attacking areas held by opposition groups, either supported or at least gave the green light to groups led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham in their assault on Aleppo. As is known, normalization efforts between Ankara and Damascus had faltered due to Assad's rejection of Erdogan's persistent attempts to initiate negotiations. At this juncture, the calculation may have been that gaining an early advantage on the ground would compel Assad to come to the negotiating table, reflecting the idea that strength in the field translates to leverage at the table. However, events unfolded so rapidly, perhaps even surprising the opposition itself, that such efforts proved unnecessary. Nevertheless, the operation was significant for Turkey, particularly in demonstrating to the Trump administration in the U.S. its influence on the Syrian front and its status as a more decisive actor than Iran or Russia. Evaluations suggesting that Turkey allowed or greenlit the operation due to unique circumstances typically summarize these conditions as follows. Failure of normalization talks with Damascus. The collapse of dialogue left Ankara exploring alternative strategies. Leverage over a new U.S. administration, with expectations that Donald Trump would eventually pull U.S. forces out of northeastern Syria. Ankara sought to enhance its bargaining power with Washington. diminished threat of PKK militias under the SDF umbrella, it was expected that these militias, without the aerial protection of US F-16s and ground support from American commandos, would no longer pose a major threat at Turkey's southern border. Weakened Iran-backed militias, Assad's primary ground forces, organized by Iran's Revolutionary Guards and heavily battered by Israeli strikes over the past year, were in poor condition. Russia's shifting priorities. With its focus on Ukraine and its interest in lifting Western sanctions via peace dividends in Syria, Russia's military footprint in Syria had lessened. In this process, Iran-led resistance forces have been considered the biggest losers, while Turkey is viewed as the primary beneficiary, having capitalized on these developments to solidify its regional influence. So, 13 years after the popular movement that began in March 2011 with a group of students in Daraa, the opposition, alongside jubilant crowds, seized control of Damascus, marking the end of the Ba'ath regime's 61-year rule. Well, folks, and with that, we end our video today. Write us your thoughts on this in the comments and let us know about which topics we should make a video about. Otherwise, subscribe to our channel and see you next time here at Wikimedia Plus. Thank you all for watching to the end. I hope you enjoyed our content. A big hug, and until then,